Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. We're going to talk about some land critters today, and I grew up seeing these guys all the time. We're going to talk about groundhogs today, huh, Drew? So what do you got to share about them?
Well, I took a look at our website this morning, and groundhogs are one of the pages that's getting the most hits right now. And just yesterday, I got a call about a groundhog problem. Had some traps strung out around the state already this year for helping people that were dealing with groundhogs. So I figured it was a good topic today.
Sounds great. Now, growing up, I heard them called woodchucks a lot. Is that same thing? Are they different because that was in Ohio, or is that's a common name for them too?
That's one of the common names for them. Marmota monax is the critter that we're talking about if we look at the Latin name, but they've got a whole bunch of different common names. So depending on where you are, you might call them groundhogs, woodchucks, chucks, whistlepigs, whistlers, ground pigs, thickwood badgers, Canada marmot, monax, moonac, weenucks, red monk, land beaver, and if you're in French Canada, you might call them a sea flu.
I think you made half of that up right there. They got a lot of different names though, right?
Yeah.
So they're found in Kansas. I've seen them running around here. I know they're in Ohio. What's their range look like?
Yeah, so we're sort of at the western boundary of their range. They stretch from basically the southeastern U.S. up to Newfoundland, over to Alaska, and then the range sort of curves back to the southeast so that most of the Great Plains is excluded. Probably Manhattan, if we looked at the map, is sort of the western boundary of their range. But, I've seen them in eastern South Dakota around Yankton when I lived up there for about a year. I've helped people with groundhog problems as far west as Phillipsburg. When we look at the Kansas Mammal Atlas, the farthest west that we have a good, like a museum specimen, is sort of Dodge City, Hayes, that distance west. They've increased over the last 100 years in Kansas. I think they've probably increased during my lifetime. I see a lot more now than I did when I was a kid, and that range has expanded a little bit to the west. But they like to be around that woody cover, so they're going to be limited in the plains. They're probably. I would guess that they've expanded as far west as they're probably going to.
Sure. So they like wooded habitat. You mentioned I've seen them in open fields. They're kind of living lots of different places. How do you know? I mean, is it just a big brown critter?
Sure.
How do you know it's a groundhog?
Yeah. Well, they're our largest squirrel.
Squirrel?
Yeah, they're actually a squirrel. They're a ground squirrel, more specifically. And, generally speaking, they're big. They're a lot bigger than what we would think of as being a squirrel, but they're nowhere near as big as a bear, right? But they're going to be somewhere between 1.5 to 2 feet long as an adult. Brown overall. They can have kind of reddish hues. Sometimes they'll have a little bit of a yellowy hue, but they tend to have a dark blackish face, kind of a short compressed skull that's a pretty robust skull. Down their back, they tend to either be red or a dark brown color, and then the tips of the coarse guard hairs, those longer furs, will be sort of frosted. That frosting, we also might call it grizzly looking, but that frosting can be sort of a silvery gray, or it can be a yellow color. They tend to have kind of reddish patches on their upper front legs, and then their feet and lower parts of their back and front legs are going to be sort of black. So that a lot of times when I'm driving down the road and I see a roadkill critter, there's things that pop out to me that say, that's this critter. And that contrasting red and black is one of the things that jumps out to me about them. They're pretty squatty. Yeah. So they've got kind of short but really powerful legs and a wide body. And so that gives them that squatty appearance, and then a short tail and rounded but not really long ears that don't really stand out.
To me, they always look. I think the name hog is rings true to me because they just look way too big for their little legs or something. They all look like they've been overeaten a little bit, and they shouldn't be able to get in a hole, to me. I mean, they like to burrow, I'd guess, right?
Yeah.
Live down in holes, but they look too chunky to be able to get in there.
They do, for sure. And they've got great big old, you mentioned them burrowing. They got great big old front claws. So they make those burrows. A lot of those different body characteristics that they have are adaptations for being below ground. Having short legs, it's hard to be in a burrow if you got really long legs, right?
Sure.
Having the shorter, rounded ears makes them collect less soil and stuff like that when they're digging around. Short tail, those are all good things. They're rodents, and so they've got those big, ever-growing front incisors like most rodents do. That's a characteristic for those critters too.
So they burrow, you said, and do they live alone? Do they live in groups when they're down in their burrows? What's that look like?
Sure. So they're the most solitary of ground squirrels that we have, but they are still a little bit social. So, when we think about a really solitary ground squirrel, we might think about prairie dogs, where we've got these complex social structures, bunch of family groups that might share burrows and overlap and live in these big colonies. Where we live, we tend to not see big colonies of woodchucks like you might have seen in Ohio. The densities here are typically lower. The further east you are, it seems like the densities are higher. And then out in the hay meadows, you might have a whole bunch of different groundhogs that are living in sort of a loose colony where you've got lots of burrows out in the same hayfield. We don't usually see that here in Kansas. What we typically would see is maybe a female and a male that have separate burrow systems that are going to overlap, and you might have a male that overlaps the burrows. His territory would overlap the burrow systems of several females, but you don't see these big colonies out in hay meadows. It tends to be a burrow here and a burrow there. They don't travel very far from their burrows. Typical daily movements of a groundhog around their burrow are going to stay within about 50 yards of that burrow.
Oh wow!
Yeah. So they don't move a long ways. A male would have a little bit bigger home range than a female would. The male body size, we talked about body size a little bit. Male body size would tend to be a little bit larger than female body size too.
Yeah, and maybe is it hard for them to move around on the surface, being the short legs and stuff, or why aren't they moving? 50 yards seems really small.
Yeah, that burrow is their safe place, right? And that's how they escape predators. They're pretty strong. They're able to fight things off. But, if a groundhog needed to get away from a coyote or a bobcat or something like that, then they need to be pretty close to that burrow system. That's their escape system. And so that's probably one of the main reasons that they don't go very far.
Yeah, get back to their house. That makes sense. Growing up, you mentioned those hayfields, but those burrows, my first real hunting experiences were, farmers letting me have access. They'd let me go hunt birds or hunt deer or something, but in exchange during the off season, I'd have to go hunt some groundhogs for them because they had these burrows everywhere. They didn't like the holes, and so where back in Ohio at least, it was common. They were a nuisance. They were everywhere, right?
Sure.
And you're saying their numbers might be a little bit. Maybe they're lower here, so that's not quite as big of an issue. I'd guess still, though, having the burrows would be something that could be potentially a hassle of having the animals around.
Yeah, it is for sure. And those burrows can be really deep, and I guess they can be really long, but fairly deep. So 25 to 30 feet long.
Wow,
a burrow can be, and then that chamber of the burrow is going to be 2 to 5 feet below the surface of the ground. Wow. They can move up to 6 cubic feet of soil out of those burrows. So how much is that? Well, the really big and deep wheelbarrows, they hold 4.
Yeah.
So a couple of those. And so we tend to see a sort of an oblong opening. It's usually a little bit smaller than the opening of a badger burrow. So it's going to be like 8 to 10 inches in diameter. It may be more round than oblong, but it's going to have a really, really large mound of soil out in front of it. So that's what we're looking for.
Do they just have one opening, these burrows? They can have multiple entrances?
Typically, they're going to have a couple, but they can have up to 5. Okay. So your normal groundhog burrow will just have 2, maybe 3 entrances, but they can have several. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting about them is they typically have at least 2 chambers inside those burrows, and they use one of those chambers as their bathroom, and the other chamber is a living space.
That seems smart.
Yeah,
these animals are smarter than I thought.
Yeah, it can definitely limit disease for a critter that spends a lot of time in their burrow.
Yeah. Do they generally just have one burrow their whole life, or are they using one at a time? What's that look like?
So the same groundhog might have multiple burrows, but they're going to have one main burrow. So,
Okay.
it might be more like they've got an escape burrow and in an area that they like to forage by, but then they've got that one main burrow that they tend to sleep in.
Sure.
Before you asked, can multiple groundhogs be in a burrow, and I don't think I did a very good job answering that. You can have multiple groundhogs that are using the same burrow, but it's more common for them, unless it's a female with young, to just have one burrow per groundhog.
And the young, how many offspring do they have?
Yeah, so they tend to breed in like February to March. They've got about a month gestation period, and the litters can be anywhere from 2 to 9, but the average litter size is going to be about 4.
February to March. I guess I thought that groundhogs hibernated, so I'm surprised to hear that it's that early.
They do. Well, when's Puxatawny Phil come out?
Well, that's true.
When's Groundhog Day?
Groundhog Day, early February.
Yeah.
That's a good point, yeah.
Yeah, so, they tend to start that hibernation in October, around the time of the first really, really deep killing frost. And then they'll come out of hibernation in that February to March time frame. But we got to remember that just because they stop hibernating, it doesn't necessarily mean that they come out of the ground and that they're active all the time.
Sure.
So they're probably spending most of that active time in February, when they might be breeding, staying in the ground or doing just a little bit of foraging and going back in, probably not spending much time out of the ground when it's real cold.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's surprising to me about hibernation is that we tend to think animals just go sleep and don't do anything for a period of a few months, but I think it's probably more like a dog sleeping. Like, in my house, they go from one couch to a chair. They're not doing much, but they're kind of they're sleeping a lot, but there's still a little bit of movement. Is that just hibernation in general? Is that really what they do, or am I off base here?
Well, even when we see like cameras on bears in dens and stuff like that,
Yeah.
they're moving around a little bit down there in the ground. But the thing to remember about critters that we talk about hibernating, there's true hibernators, and then there's critters that go through an estivation or a winter torpor or something like that.
Big words.
Yeah, they are. So, torpor, estivation, both of those words are basically referring to a temporary reduction in activity, where the metabolism slows down, the body temperature might deviate from where it normally is. But true hibernation is basically a period where the metabolism slows down incredibly. The heart rate slows down so much that it might be hard to pay attention long enough that you actually detect it.
Oh, wow.
Respiration slows down drastically. The body temperature gets down to within a few degrees of ambient. And so, if you think about a groundhog, if it's down below the frost line in the soil, during the wintertime, its body temperature may be down around 50 degrees.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they're getting quite cold. Everything's slowing way down. They probably move around a little bit and that sort of thing, but they're not feeding. They're not active. They're relying on those fat reserves. That's kind of another thing that goes along with hibernating, is leading up to hibernation, critters that do that have to put on body fat, right? So they go through this period that we call hyperphagy, which just means a lot of eating, right? So they're eating as much as they can. They're trying to pack on that fat so that they've got those reserves to rely on while they're hibernating. And that's another sort of time when you talked about their burrows causing conflict. Well, that eating that they do is the other way that they cause a lot of conflict.
Well, I think I'd be remiss if we had this entire episode and I didn't ask if a woodchuck could chuck wood. So are they playing with wood? Are they eating wood? What's their diet look like?
They're called woodchucks because they tend to be associated with woodlands, right? But, we do have that, how much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?
Yeah.
And my mammalogy lab TA, when I took mammalogy, he asked us that on a test. And apparently there was some mammologist at one point in time that did a calculation about that. And I'm going to get this wrong, but the number that I have in my head from like 20 years ago was 12 board feet. That's probably wrong, but they don't toss wood, right? But if a groundhog was picking up sticks and throwing them, that
not very long.
No.
Yeah. Well, I love that a scientist out there decided to take some time to do that calculation. That's the type of stuff I think that's fun to do. We lose a little bit of that kid spirit sometimes and take ourselves too seriously. So that's a little fun fact. But what are they eating? So they're found in the woodlands. What kind of things are they eating?
Yeah, so they're herbivores. They will eat a little bit of animal material. If a groundhog is digging around and it finds a skink or a shrew or something like that, they will eat that, consume that animal matter. They'll eat a few insects, but their diet is by and large going to be plant matter, and they're going to select broadleaf plants that have a lot of protein and that are easy to digest and that sort of thing. Lots of leafy greens. They're going to eat some stems. They'll also eat root vegetables like carrots and those sorts of things as well. But they're going to select broadleaf plants that are very nutritious and not woody things.
Do they get into crop fields, agricultural fields, and do much damage there?
They can. They tend to cause the most damage in hay meadows, like you talked about, and where we would see the most damage in terms of forage consumption in a hay field would be like alfalfa or broadleaf forage crop like that.
Okay. And I would guess in town, digging up gardens or something like that could be a problem.
Sure. That's, the main conflict that people have with them eating things tends to be in vegetable gardens because they like to eat the things that we plant that we want to consume. So that's a big challenge there. They'll also eat some herbaceous plants that folks plant as landscaping plants too. And so that's a problem. And then we also have, we talked about how big and deep those burrows are. Yeah. Well, if they dig under your house or if they dig under a shed, they dig under a sidewalk, that's not just unsightly. That could also cause, a shed to fall in a little bit or something like that. And so, that digging activity is something that bothers a lot of people too.
Yeah, I think underneath the shed seems to be a common space. When I think about, growing up, I'd see them all the time. There'd be a little hole next to a shed. I don't know that they were groundhogs, but it seems like a common place for critters to hang out.
Sure. Another critter that likes to dig underneath sheds, foxes.
Yeah.
And when we have sheds with the open foundations or sheds that are up on skids, that just makes it a whole lot more likely that that's going to happen. And so, that's a easy way to limit their access and limit that burrowing activity to a place that also keeps skunks from living underneath sheds and keeps raccoons from living underneath sheds and stuff like that. So if we can close those foundations or those gaps between the side of the shed and the soil up, that's just a really inviting place to have the entrance of a den.
Yeah.
And the soil underneath those sheds tends to loosen up. There's not vegetation that they have to dig through, and so it's just a good place for them to dig. So we can eliminate some of that pretty easily.
One of the things I've noticed, we talk about burrows, we've talked about dens. Are they the same thing, just different critters, or are they different?
Yeah, they're the same thing. It's two different names for the same thing that I'm really bad about using interchangeably.
Well, that's okay. It's just clarification.
I think one of the differences is, a burrow tends to be something that is in the ground, that's excavated, whereas a den might be in a burrow.
Yeah.
But it could also be in a hollow tree or something like that.
Sure. It's a critter's home, just a matter where it is, maybe.
Yeah.
maybe. So, if they're making a den or a burrow where we don't want them, what are some things we could do? I'm guessing blocking the hole, but what are some things we could do to control, these groundhogs that might be around?
Yeah, so if we think about our HER acronym that I like to go back to, habitat modification is what H stands for. That's the first thing. And so, the limiting open foundations would fall under that for sure. Another thing that could be included in habitat modification is just limiting the amount of cover that we have available. Groundhogs also like to dig burrows underneath wood piles and rock piles and those sorts of things. So if you got a pile of hedge posts or a loose pile of firewood somewhere, that's an inviting place for them to dig a burrow under. A rock pile would be too. So if we can eliminate those things, they're going to dig a burrow in a place with lots of low cover if they can as well. So tall weeds, tall vegetation in wooded areas and those sorts of things. If we can limit that stuff, then we can definitely make the area less inviting too. Other things, if we think about exclusion, it can be hard to exclude groundhogs because they dig under most fences. They're also really good at climbing. I've had people send me, including my mom, sent me a picture of a groundhog that was on top of a wooden privacy fence in somebody's backyard, looking out into the yard. So, if we're going to use fencing, we have to try and eliminate them digging under. So like if we think about a fence that would be good at excluding groundhogs, think about like 2-inch by 4-inch rectangles in a woven wire or a welded wire metal fence.
Yeah.
We need to have about a foot of fence that's buried below the ground. And then when we get down to that foot deep, we also need about a 1-foot apron coming out that's making an L. So the fence goes down a foot into the soil and then a foot out like that. And then we would bury that part. And then that fence also needs to be 2 to 4 feet tall, at least 2 feet tall, and then have a hot wire on top so that if they go to climb it, they're going to get shocked. That's not very practical for most situations, but if you have a high value garden that you need to exclude groundhogs from, then that would be the way to use exclusion to prevent them from getting in. Another thing that we could do in a vegetable garden is to have a tall raised bed, so like a waist high at least raised bed, and then they're good climbers, remember. So it's going to have some smooth material on it that they can't climb, like the artificial wood products that we use for decking, maybe like the Trex and those sorts of trade names might be the type of material that would be slick enough that they couldn't get up it. You could also add fencing to that to make it even better at excluding them.
If we can't keep them out, what do we have to do?
Sure. So that depends on where you are. You mentioned shooting as being an option.
Yeah.
So, if we're in a rural area where we can legally discharge and safely discharge a firearm, they're diurnal. They're like most squirrels. They're active during the daytime. And so especially if we go out in the early morning or evening time, they like to feed during the early morning because they get a lot of their water from dew. So going out during that time when they're very active, we can definitely remove. That's what R stands for in our HER acronym, right? Removal. We can remove groundhogs through shooting, and they're actually pretty good table fare.
Yeah.
I've not eaten a groundhog, but there's lots of folks who do. I've eaten a lot of beaver meat, and when I've processed groundhogs to use them for trapping bait for coyotes, that meat reminds me in both the look, the smell, and the texture a lot of beaver meat, and that's good stuff.
Yeah, I had groundhog when we always had a rule when I was growing up. If you're going to harvest something, you had to use it.
Yeah.
And so I don't. It's been so long since I've had it, I don't remember, but I remember it not being bad. So, and you remember if something doesn't taste good.
Right.
So
Right.
That's good to know you can use them. What about if you can't be shooting them? Are there things you can do in town?
Yep, there are, and cage traps work quite well for trapping groundhogs. So we're looking for like a raccoon-sized cage trap is what I would call it. At least a 10-inch by 10-inch opening where the door's at, and then at least 24 inches long. A 12 by 12 by 36 trap would work just fine too. If it's got two doors, if it's got a door on each end, it's going to need to be a little bit longer, so in that 30-inch plus range, just so that you're getting the doors closed completely while the critter's in there. And if it closed on its head, then it could slide out from underneath, right? We're trying to limit that. Cage traps tend to be most effective for groundhogs, at least from my experience, if we cover them. So I like to cover them. I typically go by a canvas tarp. The plastic type tarp material will work just fine, but it's kind of rattly and it blows in the wind. And so that I just feel like that canvas tarp lays better in the wind and doesn't make noises that might spook them away. Putting that trap fairly close to their burrow entrance works quite well, and we want to really work that trap back and forth on the surface of the soil so that it sits there stably and doesn't have a bunch of gaps underneath of it. So if their feet start to fall through those holes in the bottom of that cage when they go in, they might not feel comfortable and they might not go in. Similarly, if the trap wobbles when they start to come in, they're probably not going to go in as well.
And I'm guessing we're just putting these traps where they can go. I doubt you could bait a groundhog into a trap. You're probably just putting them where they can run.
I've had really good success baiting them.
Really?
And my favorite bait for them is bananas that are ready for banana bread. So old black slimy banana that smells pretty strong.
Overripe?
Yep, overripe banana. Those work pretty good. Sometimes those are hard to find, and so I'll just go buy some new bananas and throw them in the freezer. And they'll be ready in a day or two.
And they're attracted to that sweet smell.
They are. Spoiled cantaloupe, spoiled apples, and those sorts of things. Anything that's going to have that strong, fermented, sweet smell is pretty good. There's also some commercial baits that have those same sorts of smells that you can buy and use for them too.
Yeah. Well, I guess you learn something new every day. You can trap groundhog using some bait. So if you do catch one of these groundhogs in a trap, what do you do with them?
Sure. So, one of the things that I think we sometimes forget to mention is that it's always important to check all your local laws and regulations and that sort of thing about take of wildlife. So if we're thinking about groundhogs in Kansas, they're classified as huntable non-game, so they can be shot or trapped by anyone who has a hunting license and is using appropriate equipment. If landowners or legal occupants are experiencing property damage, then they are authorized to remove those groundhogs too, but they can't utilize them in any way. So they wouldn't be able to eat them or save the skulls or the skins or anything like that. So, if you do catch a groundhog, wildlife managers almost never recommend moving critters around. And we've got a whole episode, if you go back to early on in our podcast, about wildlife translocation and whether or not that's good. So I encourage folks to go back there and listen to that if they question what I'm about to say. But most of the time when we move critters, they don't live. So euthanizing them is the most appropriate thing to do if you do need to remove them. And just remember that this is a critter that hibernates. And so in order to hibernate and survive, they need to be able to find an appropriate spot to dig a den, and then they need to have time to excavate that great big old den. And a lot of our groundhog problems pop up during that hyperphagy time, right before, in the fall, right before they go to hibernate. And so if you trap and move a groundhog during that time frame, then it's very likely you're giving it a death sentence just because it's not going to have time to find a den. And that's excluding all the other things that we talk about in that other episode.
Yeah, and probably not a very pretty death sentence also.
Sure.
It's going to be something not very fun. If you harvest one, can you utilize their fur? Does their fur have any value?
Their fur doesn't have value in terms of in the fur market. That's not a pelt that you would sell that they would make fur garments out of and those sorts of things. But they do have pretty neat pelts. They're very colorful. They do have those long, coarse guard hairs, but they've got relatively soft under fur, and it's a pretty hide. So, I would encourage anybody who's interested in that sort of thing to skin them out, get the fur tanned or tan it themselves, and then that's a cool novelty item to have around the house to talk about when guests come over.
Sure. We've talked a lot about, some of the problems with groundhogs. Do they have any purposes in nature? What are some of the benefits of them?
Sure. Well, one of the challenges is, like, if we start to try and associate a human purpose with critters, then sometimes it can be pretty hard to come up with one.
Sure.
People like deer because we like to eat deer and we like to watch deer and those sorts of things. Some people like groundhogs because they like to eat them.
Yeah.
But they're a native herbivore that's supposed to be out there eating vegetation. They disturb the soil, and so the digging activity that they do is actually good for soil health and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily something that's good if you're a farmer and you're going to drop into their hole, but it is something that's a natural process that's good. They provide food for a lot of predators that are going to eat them and those sorts of things. If we're thinking about reasons that groundhogs can be good for people, one of the things that they're really important for us is on the research side of things. So groundhogs have liver function and chemistry that's most close to human liver function and chemistry of any mammal that we can use for research. And so they're actually the main model for research on how to treat people for liver cancer and hepatitis and those sorts of diseases. Wow. So they're important that way.
Yeah. And I think, that the nature side of things, all those ecosystem benefits is really important too, so it doesn't have to be just directly you can eat them or you can use them for research. Understanding their benefit in nature, I think, is important too.
Yeah, it is for sure.
Really cool critters. I think, learning they're a squirrel was fantastic, and then, just seeing them everywhere. Growing up, they were so common out here. They're a little bit more of a surprise to see one, but still really fun critters to have around for sure. So.
Sure.
Well, that was a great episode, Drew.
Yeah.
Lots of good information about a critter that was near and dear to my heart growing up, and great to learn a lot more about them today. So thanks for sharing all that. Thanks to all of our listeners. Make sure you're continuing to leave us some reviews and let us know topics that you think might be good to chat about, and we'll join you in a couple weeks for an aquatic episode. Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.